So I'm giving this talk to mark my stepping down as NBER Health Economics Program Director after serving in that capacity for 40 years. And I'm going to take a page out of the George Washington's playbook and make a partial farewell to my troops. But don't worry, I'm not going to take a second page out of his playbook and run for president. And it's only a partial farewell because I'm going to stay at the Bureau as New York City Office Director and Research Associate. So this slide just indicates main themes that I'm going to cover, and you can just read that for yourself. It's not very profound. So I started to work at the NBER in 1966, and this is a picture of the New York NBER office in that year. This was the only office of the NBER at that time. And for those of you who are below a certain age, the Bureau is a New York corporation, and until 1978, there was no Cambridge office. So it's June of 1966, and I had completed all my courses and exams at Columbia. I did not have much money, and Eileen and I were thinking about getting married. So I was looking for a summer job at the same time as Vic Hughes was looking for a research assistant. Harry Becker recommended me to Vic, and Vic hired me for the summer. Thanks to Vic, I celebrated 2 50th anniversaries in 2016. One was my 50-year association with the NBER. The second was Eileen and I got married. So Vic hired me to work on his book titled The Service Economy, and this is a picture of the title page of the book. And I worked on a chapter of that book which compared cyclical fluctuations in the service sector to those in manufacturing. Now, note that the book was published by the NBER. Until around 1978, the Bureau published all of its books and monographs with the help from a large in-house editorial staff. Columbia University Press distributed them. This is an acknowledgement from the book by Vic, and this is evidence that I actually did some work on the book, and you'll see that Irv Levison was Vic's main research assistant, and I'll say something about Irv in just a little while. Like me, Irv was a PhD candidate at Columbia. Now, my work on a chapter of this book which compared cyclical fluctuations in the service sector to those in manufacturing led to my short-lived career as a macroeconomist. And Bob Kessner did not know that I was a macroeconomist. So this is the cover page of this journal, Annals of Economic and Social Measurement. And Vic and I actually published a paper in the July 1973 issue of the journal. And the title, you'll see that he had the lead article, and it's a little bit hard to read the title. It says Intersectoral Shifts and Aggregate Productivity Change. This journal was one of two short-lived journals started by the Bureau. The other one was Explorations in Economic Research. And in our paper, we examined the effect of the secular shift in employment towards the service sector on cyclical fluctuations in aggregate output per person hour. Now, here's something that I wrote. I actually wrote this in the paper. Vic didn't write it. And there was some interesting reactions to it. Oh, this thing sounds good. This sounds not so good. So come back to my actual work in health economics at the NBER. So this is my first 3 years, and it started in late August of 1966 when Vic made me an offer that I could not refuse. And the offer was to work for him half-time and to work on my dissertation half-time if I did a dissertation in health economics. And that's how I became interested in the field. Up until then, I had no exposure to it. Vic's offer was the partial cause of my specialization in health economics throughout my career, and also the partial cause of my marriage in September of 1966. Now, I say it was the partial cause because there is a reverse causality issue. The offer Vic made to me partially caused our decision to get married. But our desire to get married partially caused me to accept his offer. And that's only fitting for someone like me who spends a lot of time investigating whether more schooling really causes better health. But I always like to say that in retrospect, in 1966, an investment in health economics paid me the best interest. So in October 1966, Harry Becker suggested a topic for my dissertation. And that topic was to view health as being demanded. Of course, it is an item in the utility function, and as a component of the stock of human capital, it's also a determinant of earnings. So I spent the next 3 years working on my dissertation and also working for Vic. I left in June of 1969 to spend 2 years as a research associate at the Center for Health Administration Studies of the University of Chicago. I received an offer from Vic in the late fall of 1970 to return to the NBER as a full-time research associate. I accepted that offer and returned for good in June of 1971. I began to teach at the City University of New York Graduate Center in September 1972 and spent the next 45 years doing that full time and working at the Bureau part-time. So now economic history. So the first publication, the first NBER publication with a significant health economics component was co-authored by who? Who co-authored it? For $1 million. It was Milton Friedman and Simon Kuznets, and they published this book in 1954, and they dealt with medicine and dentistry as two of the independent practices. But Vic was really the first NBER research associate to focus on health beginning in the early 1960s. And I want to highlight three very early contributions. The first one is Vic's paper here, which I have on the slide. And this is a great unpublished paper, and I mean that. It is a terrific paper. Vic finds in it a negative effect of schooling on mortality, somewhat surprisingly a positive effect of income. And he did not try to publish it because he included health inputs as exogenous variables and was concerned about reverse causality. And that led to a second paper by Irv Levison and his two colleagues. And as I mentioned, Irv was Vic's full-time research assistant, and he was a major contributor to this paper. And the paper treated medical care as an endogenous input in two-stage least squares estimation. Harry Becker read an early version of this paper in 1966, and he was concerned about the lack of a conceptual framework and by the failure to distinguish between health production and health demand function. And that led him to suggest that I do both and test the empirical implications in my dissertation. And so the third paper is my PhD dissertation, which I finished in 1970 and which was published as an NBER occasional paper number 119 in 1972. Vic's paper, Irv's paper with his co-authors, and my occasional paper led to a focus of much of the health economics research at the Bureau on the determinants of the health of the population. And I want to emphasize, anyone who says that I established health economics as an area of investigation at the Bureau is wrong. Also in 1972, Vic started this NBER Center for Economic Analysis of Human Behavior and Social Institutions. I always thought he should have picked a shorter name. So he founded it with himself as the director, with Gary Becker as the research policy advisor, and with 5 programs, which are highlighted on this slide. And Vic, in doing this, drew heavily on pioneering research by Gary, by Jacob Mintzer, by himself, by Irv and his colleagues, and last and least of all, by me. These programs are the forerunners of a number of the Bureau's current programs. All right, so as I've already said, my NBER occasional paper was published in 1972. And I want to point out that contributions to the occasional paper series were too long to be journal articles and too short to be books. A number of very well-known economists contributed to the series, including Vick, George Stigler, and Milton Friedman. And keep in mind that my occasional paper was number 119. All right, so it's 1972, and why am I in some trouble? Well, there was a critical editorial of my occasional paper in this magazine, and you'll see what the editorial said. It was not very flattering. So take a minute to read it. I'll go on. So this is the picture of the cover page of that magazine. And it turned out that my late father subscribed to it. And he phoned me about the editorial because he was very upset about it. And I told him, Dad, ad publicity is better than no publicity. And that became my first rule of research. My second rule is to never take myself too seriously. All right, so I'm still in some difficulty. This is much later trouble for my occasional paper. So here's something that was written in a very recent paper by two very well-known economists. And the paper came out this past March, and they actually gave it at the AEA meetings. And you'll see that my occasional paper ended the series. Now, they were nice enough not to mention my name as the author of that occasional paper. And I always thought that it was ironic that a paper on health marked the death of the series. So more recently, I've gotten some better publicity, and this is a meme that was created by Alfredo Paloyo, who's an economist at the University of Wollongong in Australia. And he put it on Twitter, and it has migrated to Facebook. And I'll give you a minute to read it. I invited him to come to the conference, and I hope he's here, although it's 3 a.m. in the morning on Tuesday in Australia. So I'll go on. So let me turn to what I was up to in the 1970s. Oh, I did a fair amount of work on the issue, on this issue here. Does horse schooling really cause better health? And I had a paper in the 1976 NBER volume, and the paper was 65 pages, and it was really long enough to be an occasional paper, although the occasional paper series had passed away by then. So in this paper, I set out a much more detailed conceptual framework than the one in my occasional paper for dealing with the schooling health relationship. So I dealt with reasons for expecting causality in both directions, for the importance of omitted third variables. Empirically, I estimated what one I think of as kitchen sink ordinary least squares regressions. Although I did think I try to hold interesting variables fixed. Much more recently, I have this paper on the same issue, and this paper does differences and instrumental variables applied to a quasi-natural experiment. So I finally adopted 21st century econometric techniques with help from my co-authors Ted Joyce, Xinyi Chao, and Chintan Pu. And it was hard for them to help me because, as Tim Roper once said about me, I am a man of simple taste. I like baseball, beer, and ordinary least squares. Tim is a recent alumnus of the CUNY Graduate Center. So also in the 1970s, I had a large project on the determinants of children's health. And these are the areas that we investigated. So we did a lot of work on the effect of parents schooling again. This was joint work with Linda Edwards, Bob Shikotko, and Fred Goldman. The paper by Peter Savrilev. Now, there's a lot of work in this area since the paper by Peter Savrilev that he will present next is the latest example of the schooling health causality issue. The paper that Adam Spicone will present after Peter is an example of research on race differences. The papers that Randy Hajamarson and Arieka Bars will present tomorrow are examples of research on other determinants of health outcomes. But I'm still in some trouble. And the reason is that papers on whether schooling causes health come out every single year. In a real good year, 50% say that schooling does cause health, which is what I've always said and found. And that is like my batting average of 500 in the New York State Veterans of Foreign Wars League's playoff competition in 1957. And that's based on a small sample of 2 at-bats. For those of you who do not love baseball as much as I do, a batting average of 500 means that you get a hit 50% of the times that you are at bat. There's a much smaller percentage of papers that find that schooling causes health in other years. And that's more like my batting average of 154 during the regular season of 1957. And that's based on a much bigger sample of 39 at-bats. Thanks to Peter, I think I'm hitting 1,000 this year based on his paper, although that's the only paper that I've seen this year because I hardly ever read anything anymore. And this has led to my third rule of research, which is that it's better to be the first or one of the first, even if you're wrong. All right, so in 1978, NBER office moves to 269 Mercer Street on the campus of NYU. And this is a picture of the office. In the same year, Marty Feldstein becomes president. He forms the health economics program in 1980 and appoints Vic and me as co-directors. My recollection, he never asked me if I wanted to serve in that capacity, but I was delighted that he named me. A few years later, I find out that Vic has decided to step down and that Marty has named me as director again without asking me. So I started some research in the 1980s, and I had a project on infant health outcomes, and we focused on public policies and programs. And these are the issues that we focused on. And this was joint work with Hope Corman, Ted Joyce, and Steve Kolbowitz, and much later with Shinyi Chow and Chintan Liu. And in that latter research, we focused on the impacts of national health insurance on birth outcomes in Taiwan. Now, there is a lot of subsequent research in these areas, both inside and outside the Bureau, and the paper that Maulani will present today is an example of that research. Also in the 1980s, I began a second area of investigation on the economics of unhealthy behaviors. And this and these are examples. My papers in this area account for the largest percentage of my publications, and the major focus of my research from the mid-1980s to the present. I have worked on all of these behaviors except for the opioid epidemic. My work on the economics of unhealthy behaviors began at the Mercer Street office and has accompanied me to 3 additional locations of the office. So from 1995 to 1999, it was at 50 East 42nd Street, and that's a picture of the building the office was. From 1999 through 2013, it was in the Altman building at 365 Fifth Avenue, which is right opposite the Empire State Building, and that's on the campus of the CUNY Graduate Center. From 2013 to the present, it's been at 5 Hanover Square in the Wall Street area, and that's a picture of the building. The Bureau has had 6 offices in New York City, and I've worked in 5 of them. And that ties a record I share with the late Bob Lipsy and the late Anna Schwartz. Now, and I told Vic that the office had moved again in 1913. So he said, and this is with apologies to the guys and dolls, and you can read what he said. I love this. So I'll give you a minute to read it. All right, so I've been spending a lot of time on the economics of unhealthy behaviors, and I want to tell you a little bit about how I began on it. So in 1978, Doug Code, Gene Hewitt, and I decided to submit an NIH proposal on teenage smoking and alcohol use. And at that time, the U.S. anti-smoking campaign was 14 years old, and there was a much newer, but also a real active anti-drinking campaign. But the real prices of cigarettes, beer, wine, and distilled spirits had been falling for an awfully long time, mainly because federal excise taxes on these goods had been fixed in nominal terms since 1951. And so we were interested in seeing whether the law of the downward sloping demand function really held. This figure highlights that there were these big reductions in these real prices. So in the language of modern econometrics, we thought that we had power to detect effects. So here's the outcome of the proposal, and you can see it was not funded. And so before we decided to submit a revised proposal, we decided to do some field work. I was the one designated to do the field work. So here I'm investigating smoking cigarettes or marijuana. I'm not sure which. Here I'm investigating the demand for alcohol. And you'll see that Ted Choice is on the left. He looks much older now. I look the same. Here I'm investigating whether substance use causes risky sexual behavior. So ultimately, we were successful. We funded a number of NIH grants dealing with the economics of unhealthy behaviors, and we did a lot of work in this area, and we continue to work in this area. And here's a list of people who I worked with. There are 30 people on this list. Let me just highlight a couple of results. So we find that the behaviors at issue are sensitive to price. So, for example, that this paper that Wood and I did in 1981, and we find that teenage cigarette smoking price elasticity of minus 1.2. Now, there are much smaller elasticities have been reported since then, but as a new NBER, NBER Health Economics Research Associate, and Reese reports an elasticity of almost exactly the same magnitude that Hewitt and I got in this NBER working paper. Now, I made the computation and does not report elasticities in his paper. He gives other measures of magnitudes. So I'm not sure if he would agree with my estimate of the elasticity in his paper. I'll have to talk to him about that. Now, there's a tremendous amount of research on the economics of unhealthy behaviors, again, inside the NBER, outside of it. The paper that Nathan Teff will present tomorrow is an example. For many more of my results and those of others including some who do not agree with me, see. And this is my book, which was published in 2017. This book has 800 pages, and at $80, it's somewhat pricey, but it has multiple uses. Henry Safely uses it as a paperweight. I use it as a seat cushion if I'm stuck sitting directly behind Kit Carpenter at a seminar. And I've actually received some royalties from the book, mainly because I bought a number of copies myself. So in conclusion, after 54 years of marriage, I still love my two wives, Eileen and the NBER. Now, that's the end of my slide. I have something else to read, and I'd like to thank some people. So I owe a debt to the late Gary Becker that I could never repay. I also owe a debt to the very much alive Vic Fuchs that I can never repay. I owe a debt to the late Marty Feldstein for appointing me as health economics program director, and for allowing me to direct the program in an independent manner. It has been my privilege and pleasure to interact with Jim Peterba since he became NBER president in 2008. I especially want to thank him for all his help in finding a new office when the Bureau was forced to leave the Altman building in 2013. I want to thank all my co-authors, and I have had an awful lot of them, for all their help. I want to thank the NBER staff in Cambridge for all their help over the years. I especially want to thank Rob Shannon for helping me to organize a health economic workshop at the Summer Institute for a long time. And I especially want to thank him for his help this year, when I'm sure I drove him crazy because I was so paranoid about not wanting to mess up my swan song. I want to thank Marinella Muscani for being the best business manager and administrative assistant one could imagine. Like my wife, Eileen, she is a jack of all trades and a master of all. I'm delighted that Kit Carpenter has agreed to serve as the next health economics program director, and I want to thank him for doing that. I'm sure that he will be terrific. And I also want to remind him that when he and I started to play tennis in 2010, the ratio of my age to his age was exactly equal to 2. Since then, that ratio has fallen. In the long run, it will approach 1, and he will lose his advantage. Finally, I have to thank Eileen. She and I are a real-world example of the foundation of Gary Becker's theory of marriage, based on the theory of comparative advantage, and with other factors held constant. It is optimal for a high-wage individual to marry one with a much lower wage. For many years, her earnings in technology far exceeded mine. That gave me the luxury to teach and to pursue research that, while not nearly as rewarding from a monetary standpoint, paid me a good deal of psychic income. And finally, I'm not a religious person, but at the social hour at 5 p.m., please have a glass of your favorite beverage handy. Here in my case, wine if you must, and join me in the traditional Jewish toast, behind to life. It would make my late father very happy. I'm through.